Alright, this is one I've been meaning to do for like a couple of years now, but for some reason I kept putting it off, which is weird because I love talking about Hitchcock so much. And we're going up again, we've got his only Best Picture winner, and a movie, or story I guess you could say, that coined a term that's pretty much more popular now than ever, which is very interesting because the easy thing here would have been if we're talking about sort of just in the absolute vaguest sense, in regards to what these two things have in common, is the whole idea of not just the whole gaslighting thing between it's obviously the concept of gaslight, and then we have what Mrs. Danvers is doing to Mrs. De Winter, but the whole thing of can you or can you not trust your brand new husband that you're so incredibly in love with. We could have easily done the movie that Hitchcock did one of the movies that Hitchcock did right after Rebecca the following year in Suspicion, which actually ended up getting Fontaine her Oscar. But I just wanted to talk about Gaslight. It's really just as simple as that. So we can, I guess, go into Rebecca first, and then we'll kind of eventually bleed into Gaslight, and just kind of talk about them individually. But obviously, the similarities and comparisons and themes or whatever are gonna inevitably come up. But starting with Rebecca, we do have obviously we're coming from Daphne du Maurier, the author of the book that I read over the summer. And I've only read it once, so if I, get any minute details slightly wrong, I hope I don't piss off the diehard fans too much, but that shouldn't happen. So, and she's obviously a sort of master in her own right, kind of doing more like romance novels, but she's also kind of got the kind of similar moods that Hitchcock went for. He even, when he did The Birds, is very, very, very loosely based on her work, but she's also responsible for Don't Look Now, which we'll may or may not be talking about before this month is over, but the week we have left. But yes, so the great thing about this story, starting right off, in regards to like categorizing it, because obviously I've chosen to do it in October when we're doing all the horror stuff, but obviously that's kind of we like to go into the gray areas also there. And this is an interesting case, seeing as how Rebecca has no like supernatural qualities whatsoever, but it might as well be a ghost story. Like that's basically what it is, just without the actual supernatural element. And the thing to note right away is about this movie sort of having a significant place in movie history, for a number of reasons. But if you want to talk about like starting points, like literally the jumping off point would be when we are talking about the opening line, where it's I think it's more of a thing in literature probably, but there's also plenty of movies where it says a lot about their impact if you can just say the very first line and it is immediately identifiable. And Last Night I Dreamt I Went to Manderley Again is like, what else could you possibly associate that with? Like, I feel like even people that haven't read the book or seen the movie have surely heard that at some point and could identify, well, that's I'm pretty sure that's Rebecca at least. So, going into it from there, we start off with basically a love story. Like the whole first portion of the movie might as well be like its own short film, with hardly any sort of sinister undertones that eventually come into it. But they're still kind of here, but in a way that's sort of like there's something about Maxim when we see him and the way Olivier plays him, where it's like, of course he's dark and mysterious, obviously, but it's interesting how he's able to balance that with the scenes that he has with Fontaine very early on, before they even get to Manderley, and he's also like a very charming romantic lead, despite the fact that we know there's something very dark underneath that, and something that he is potentially hiding. Potentially to the people that don't know, certainly to the people that do. Uh, and the thing about this is when you watch them talking, like especially with the way we build up manually before we really see it, prior to when we see it in the opening scene, because that's more of a in like a dreamlike, kind of vague dreamlike state we're seeing it. But when he's like talking about Manderley to her, it sort of reminds me of sort of like when you're listening to old fairy tales or something, and you have the lonely princess talking about where she comes from or whatever, while the prince is there to kind of come in and change that story up for her. It feels like it's kind of the opposite end here, even though it's certainly him changing her life in a big way by sweeping her off somewhere, but it's the way he talks about Manderley that feels like he's almost like the lonely prince in place of that. Kind of has that vibe to him, and then we go into the sort of playful romantic aspect where he's obviously got these dark moments that just kind of come suddenly when something hits that seems to remind him of the past or whatever, or any time that very looming R makes an appearance. But for the most part, there is such an innocence to this, especially with Mrs. De Winter, who's not Mrs. De Winter yet in this particular case. The innocence that comes off of her is sort of making this like this almost wholesome thing, like the whole sequence where they're playing phone tag. Before anything even happens. Like I said, this whole portion is like basically its own story. And the antagonist of this story, I guess, would be Mrs. Van Alper, if nobody else. So we establish what she has to get away from and where she would like to be, which is with Max. So when they get there, it feels like we're seeing the end of a story. Like a princess come and is sweeping her off her feet and taking her somewhere to live in this place of like this desired place of wonder. So what's really great about this is when they arrive at Manderley, and of course it's raining. Raining would usually mean like, you know, dark and gloomy or all that, but there's something about the way the rain looks in the movie through the Oscar-winning cinematography, which is the only other Oscar it won besides picture, interestingly enough. And when they arrive, we get this look at the house, and it's like the way it sort of reveals itself, where even though we, you know, got a glimpse at the opening, it's like the way this is shot, it's sort of like it looks massive, and just when you think it looks like maximally massive, it's still panning over to show more. And what I love about this, and the way we're looking at it through the rain, and the way it's got this very romantic feel as they pull up to it, rather than a dark and gloomy one or a sinister one, is it's like if you keep referring to it as like a fairy tale, seems to be what they're living right now. It's this right here, like them arriving to the house as it's raining, is basically the last fairy tale moment they have for the rest of the movie. Like, they may still be in love, but as far as like fairy tale moments go, this is like the last one, when they first arrive to the house before they've even gone inside. Like the second Mrs. Danvers basically glides up to the camera, the fairy tale is basically over from that point on. I mean, obviously Rebecca is always going to be a looming thing, but to like pinpoint a place visually in the movie, I feel like this is when it starts to take off in seemingly a whole different direction and a whole different tone. But yeah, talking about how it's sort of like Rebecca is constantly this looming thing, and I love the way they use certain visuals for that, not just necessarily every time we see the R, but also like the way her bedroom looks, where like the curtains are so incredibly massive, like everything just feels like it's towering over her and like looking down on her, figuratively and otherwise. And that's like to the point that even if the presence of Mrs. Danvers wasn't here, it would still feel like there was an active force of some kind against her presence here. Which is creepy in this really beautiful way. Like it's weird to like be able to equate the words creepy and beautiful at the same time to one particular thing, and this movie does that pretty much through its whole runtime. Like, it's basically the two things happening at once. And just really the whole idea of Mrs. De Winter not even getting a first name. Like, her first name is described in the book, but we still don't know what it is. But it's like this whole thing of the main focus of the entire movie. The movie's title, the whole identity of the movie, is the first name of the former wife. And to just completely shrink this character in the way that the story needs, to not even give her that, is this really incredible technique. Like, it's, yeah. So, going into that, we do have those moments also where there are times where it seems like she's a little nonchalant at first, and kind of her innocence is coming through. Like, she gets a "no, this is Patrick" moment for the SpongeBob fans. It's when she just answers the phone and they want Mrs. De Winter, and she just casually says, "Oh no, Mrs. Winter, has been dead for over a year," and seems to think nothing of saying that so bluntly before she hangs up. But as it goes on, obviously, we're going to kind of see a shift as this gets darker and darker, which is, you can equate a lot of this to Bergman's performance in Gaslight as well. Where obviously the forces are coming, the antagonistic forces are coming from different places, not just the whole looming factor in regards to Rebecca herself, who is not even here, but there's Mrs. Danvers, but there's also with Gaslight, it's actually coming straight from the beloved figure in her eyes, the husband. But there's still something about the way we see Max, especially in scenes where, like I said, the visuals tell so much of the story by themselves. Where we get this scene that was actually added, that wasn't in the book, I believe, the projector scene, where we've seen Max like snap from time to time, and it certainly sets up that there's something that he's hiding or something inside him. But the way this particular projector scene is shot, when they're in the dark, and he's already a little bit out of shape because he doesn't know how to work the projector. But as it goes on, and it's like she's making these comments, and it's making it worse, and he's like literally shrouded in darkness. Just kind of shows, it's almost like when you talk about the darkness that somebody has inside them, it's like now we're seeing literally the darkness in front of him as this is coming out. And it's one of those cases where, much like her, we're never quite sure, because we're sure that Mrs. Danvers is doing a whole lot of gaslighting, and if you're going into it for the first time, which is the perspective I tend to like to look at when we're talking about this kind of stuff, there's an uncertainty of his whatever the darkness could be. In this case, we know it's guilt or not guilt, which is different from medium to medium, but we'll get to that. But what's also interesting about everything seeming like she's in this foreign place, because when you talked about it being like, this place of wonder and this place that people desire to be at, and I believe there's a moment in the book where she describes it as like, that's what it was, but then the second she got there, it was more like going to a new job or going to a new school or something, that feeling. To where like you have to be in your place or you're gonna get in some kind of trouble or something. But in this really like intimidating and kind of terrifying way. And another thing that's gonna make this place feel even more foreign is more and more characters coming in that are very, because you come in. If you go into a place that's foreign to you and you're nervous being there and you feel like you don't belong, the worst possible thing you could be around is people who are very comfortable. And a lot of those people are coming in also. Like we have the brother-in-law who will speak to you without hearing a damn thing you're saying, which is not going to help that at all, though it's a nice kind of comedic touch, the way it's shown in the movie, where it's like, when he's talking about she's talking about how she doesn't ride horses, and his response is, well, how do you ride? And then there's the whole thing where he catches himself saying it, when she says that he's talking about like doing the rumba, and she says that she's never done it, and he says, you'll have to teach me sometime. It's like just talking to those people that just do not hear what you're saying at all, which can be, like I said, very nerve-wracking as far as a real-life experience, and definitely in Mrs. De Winter's case, surely. But I do like that it's kind of a comedic touch in the context. And then we have like Ben, who's kind of like all-seeing. He's sort of like it's almost like he's the horror movie character that's like warning you before you go. He kind of gives that vibe, but the person here, obviously, who fits this bill the most, apart from Mrs. Danvers, would have to be Havel, who is brilliantly cast and played by George Sanders. And this, especially the way they meet, where he's like at the window, there's just something so unnatural and surreal about that. That scene, just, I don't know, that scene's just always been, like, in a good way, like, in a really nice, sort of disorienting way. It's almost like the way you'd meet somebody in some weird dream or something. Um, and it's interesting also when he shows up towards the end, and he appears to her again in the car window. And it's like, that's the way he's always, like, windows seem to summon him whenever she would least like to see him. And it's like, and you can maybe look at it in a bit of a literal sense, like, she's always meeting Favel through windows because he sees through what's going on, I suppose. I know that might also be a reach, but I'm just assuming. But yeah, but the thing here that really stands out is Judith Anderson's performance as Mrs. Danvers, which Olivier, Fontaine, and Anderson all got Oscar nominations. But talking about, like, the scenes where, not even necessarily just the scenes where she's, like, blatantly straight up gaslighting her, but just the scenes where she's, like, really, really planting the seeds of discomfort. Like when she's just taking Mrs. De Winter through Rebecca's nightly routine, and kind of sensing that closeness where it's like I was talking about, where if there's one thing that's gonna make you uncomfortable in a place that's foreign to you, it's going to be the comfortable people, and the fact that Mrs. Danvers basically is almost like you talk about how Rebecca kind of feels like a ghost in the house, despite the fact that that's not literally the case. But it's also kind of that sense of, you get that sense from Mrs. Danvers also, who is a living character. But like, she's just so specter-like. Especially the scene when she's like saying, you know, like, go on, do it. And it's like she's this dark figure and just kind of her face comes in. And it's like, it's one of those cases where, like, when you see horror movies and it's like the ghost just comes with the house. And it's like, I feel like Mrs. Danvers kind of falls into that category as well. So the scariest part of that is that she's an actual living being, and is able to be so evilly calculated, or calculatedly evil, however you want to put it. And it's particularly this moment with the whole dress scene, of course, especially when it gets to the point where, like, when I talked about, like, it kind of feels like their last fairy tale moment is when they arrive at the house and everything after that. Like, every time there's happiness, you have to be suspect, which is something that's very prominent in Gaslight, where it's like there can't even be, like, one little moment. Like, they if I remember correctly, they really build this up in the book, where, like, her, you know, working with the maids to, you know, get the dress together and do all that is, like, the best thing that's ever happened to her. And, of course, leading to the outcome that it does, because of Mrs. Danvers' sadism, really. So, and that whole thing where it's just, like, she's almost, like, when you talk about, like, you know, spirits in the house, despite the fact that she's a living being, you also think of, like, vengeful spirits, where, like, when you hear ghost stories about how they're here, they have, like, unfinished business, and it's like, Mrs. Danvers is basically here for the unfinished business of driving whoever out of the house like a ghost would, but just in the most drastic way possible, and the most, like, and the thing also is talking about, you know, how well the gaslighting works, is that it's so, it almost seems like it would be a hard thing to accept, if it wasn't just something that you see so often now, especially with, like, how impressionable her character is. And like I said, that innocence where she hasn't really seen much of anything in life. So it's like she's fragile enough that Mrs. Danvers could spot from a mile away how easy it would be to just be able to plant these little seeds and then say, oh, by the way, jump out the window. But it builds in such this, you know, perfectly subtle way, to the point that Mrs. De Winter never knows when the seeds are being planted. and yeah, yeah, and it's easily got to be one of the best villain characters in movies and maybe even literature also, which I'm not quite as versed in, but I can only assume. And what's really interesting about this and all these moments that make it very almost, like I said, like a ghost story basically, is the how seamlessly it transitions in this moment, because you would think it's taking a big turn into like thriller territory when Max confesses to her. And in this case, of course, it is that she fell while they were arguing and she died. And I love that. I mean, it goes without saying that we never see Rebecca as a character physically at all. But it's another thing to really love that it that they don't show that in particular. In regards to like this could have very easily been like the one time we actually saw Rebecca in the movie, is to show exactly what happened. But not only does not showing it preserve the just the greatness of never seeing her at all and giving her that constant looming feel through the whole movie forever. Um, but it's the fact that we can always sort of question what it is we're being told and whether what is true or what isn't true. And there's obviously there's differences here between this and the book, where he does shoot her in like basically a crime of passion, like a heat of the moment kind of thing, which does, as far as us, an audience watching this and hearing the story and the build up to it, is he never descends into, oh my god, he could kill Mrs. De Winter. It never goes in that direction, and we never really feel that it could by the time it gets to the end of this. Um, there's a number of reasons why that change came up, to my understanding. The main one being something we brought up before talking about older movies, which is the whole kind of rule there was for a while there, way back in the day, where movies couldn't show somebody getting away with like a really big crime. So obviously they pretty much had to change it for that in itself, which is a spoiler for like so many movies of that era. But the thing also is, it's I could see it being considered like a cop out. But I do think it's interesting. I wouldn't like, it'd be kind of hard to associate Hitchcock with the phrase cop out. Unless you count maybe the psychiatrist scene in Psycho doing the whole exposition thing, but that's not really the kind of copping out we're talking about. Because you have where it's, like I said, the way it totally changes how we view his character. And how it almost like it, just these little details like make him an entirely different person between book to movie. And I feel like the way Olivier plays him maybe suits what the movie went for. Like it works in the movie's context the way it goes, and it works in the book's context the way it went. Because it does sort of, like I said, the way it starts off is kind of, you know, a love story, which obviously you can get that vibe in the book, of course, but kind of being able to see the chemistry between Olivier and Fontaine, there is something there that it does sort of, it could maybe be seen as a little more satisfying, depending on who you are and how you're reacting. That the character doesn't go in such a dark direction, that he is like pretty much fully innocent, apart from the fact that he covered it up, obviously. But apart from that, yes, and that at least that stranger's corpse got a nice burial, so good for it, I guess. But yeah, but I do think it works, especially when we get into, like I said, that transition, where it seems like from here, when he kind of, you know, starts the way the scene kind of reaches its end. Also, I remember correctly, it's the way the chapter ends in the book when he says like, you know, do you love me now, or something to that effect. And there's almost something so sinister in it. But then when we go down a different path that's less thriller-like and more like almost like legal drama, and when it gets into the blackmail aspect with Favell, then it's basically an entirely different story from that point. Like I said, that transition is so seamless that it works, and we're still like right there in it, and especially, like I said, depending how we've gotten to the characters up to this point. There's and I also kind of love the idea that Favell's the one that's blackmailing them, so it's sort of like somebody that's still directly related to Rebecca is still like the what's causing the conflict. So it's like it's still her presence is never really leaving, and with Favell still here. So in the way Sanders plays it in such that snaky way, where he just kind of it's almost like he slithers in and out of scenes. It just really kind of works in its favor. Now, then we get to the ending, which is much more dramatic than the was. There's been a number of adaptations. Like I think there was a mini series or two. The only adaptations I've seen are this one and the remake that's gonna be the next video. And I love the end of the book, when we are basically kind of vaguely described to that Manderley is burning as they're pulling up to it. And obviously this one gets a little more dramatic with her still being there, and we see the whole thing, but it does also kind of give a little more closure to Danvers that I think kind of suits the movie especially. But it can maybe seem maybe a bit too, almost in that Psycho sense, a bit too like showing exactly what's going on. But I think as far as like a movie goes and an adaptation goes, that's appropriate. So that we do kind of get that last bit of closure, and we're able to get like the final visual of the pillow burning is the whole ending is just totally unforgettable anyway. And this, especially with the visual style they went with, just everything about this ending has always worked for me. And it's this kind of great closure that is just a tiny bit, like just a little step further than from where the book stopped. Yeah, and that's, I think, pretty much the extent of my feelings on Rebecca. Obviously, I don't know that it's one of my favorite Hitchcocks, because that's obviously a really high bar, but it's a movie I find myself coming back to a number of times. Like I've probably watched it at least 3 or 4 times in the last 3 years, which is a lot in many cases. So yeah, and obviously the performances and cinematography and all that stuff, and that Hitchcock touch where they did make those certain changes. But nothing really stands out to me personally in regards to any changes that were too much, I guess, or kind of deviated too much, despite the fact that there's such a drastic one in regards to how Rebecca died. But I still think it works in the favor of each medium that it's in. Once again, that might sound like a cop-out, but that's the way it is, at least to me. So with keeping a lot of these things we were talking about, we can come over to Gaslight, which was not a book, but it was a play from 1938, I think, and then it got an adaptation in 1940, a British one, which is very interesting when you talk about the concept of gaslighting, where it's like maybe in some instances, if you were gaslighting someone, you might want to make them think that something didn't actually exist that does. Because to my understanding, they were like worried about that or something. So before they made this version, they tried to have copies of the 1940 movie destroyed, unsuccessfully. But I haven't seen the 1940 movie myself, but I've heard that it's kind of got its own sort of artful touches to it that this movie doesn't have, but this is obviously the main one that I've gravitated towards over time. But I was watching, the first time I saw it was on Turner Classic Movies, like really late at night, and I was immediately like taken by it and the story itself. And the story was just so insane to me. Like I can't remember if I had seen Rebecca yet by then. I might not have. So the idea of being able to like get inside somebody's head and make them think things that aren't true was a really creepy concept. And then long after that, I started hearing the phrase gaslighting being used. And it's like I didn't even take it as a term. I initially thought, wow, I didn't realize so many people had seen that movie or had heard of that movie to use it like that. Like what I wasn't hearing it as a term, I was hearing it as a movie reference. And so after a while, and I started hearing the term more, I just assumed like, oh, that must have been they cleverly, the movie cleverly used that phrase. So I was surprised again to learn that no, it actually does come from this story. So that's very impressive, like I said, especially since it's a term you're hearing so much like with each year, which is crazy. So going into that, once again, like Rebecca, we start off with a love story, but this one is much more kind of immediate and kind of easier to question. Like we know pretty quickly that Gregory might be off in the way that he behaves very much. He reminds me, interestingly enough, ironically enough, the way he behaves kind of reminds me a lot of Joseph Cotton's performance in Shadow of a Doubt, who is the person looking for him in this movie, of course. So, and like Cotton in that movie, it was Charles Boyer kind of going against the parts he was normally known for. Like he was normally known for like romantic leads, I think. But and obviously there's a very extensive filmography, and this was kind of the case where it was him kind of going in a different sort of unexpected direction. And that's one of those cases where you kind of go back in your mind and you're wondering, like, was that, like, if people thought, is that going to work? And much like Cotton and Shadow of a Doubt, it's like, this is one of the first times I saw them, so it was like, this is what I had in mind, and then when I saw their lighter roles, or their less evil roles, I guess you could say, that was the jarring part to me. So, yes, going into this, we do have their relationship is so sudden, we don't even see the beginning of it. We know that they, like, work together and he plays piano while she sings, and then it's just kind of revealed to us, oh, by the way, they have this going on, seemingly on the side, but they're also, like, very close to getting married, apparently. And it all feels much like, the way the relationship actually went. For us, the audience, it's also like, this is happening very fast, which, red flags, but not for a very impressionable, in love Ingrid Bergman here. So, who, did I mention, won the Oscar for this? I can't remember, but yes, she did. So, apologies if I repeat myself by accident. So, what's interesting about this going in is it's talking about like the way we see how impressionable she is. There is a really sort of very clever and creepy touch here at the very beginning, when she's first arriving and she's on the train and she's talking to Dame Mae Woody there, who is kind of the comedy relief throughout the movie. And it's her reading, she's describing a story that sounds like it's Bluebeard, or at least something very similar, which is of course about a husband who kills his many wives. And it's like, in the way this sort of transitions into her talking about the murder that happens in the opening scene of the movie, or what we're seeing the aftermath of in the opening scene of the movie, where her Anne was killed and now she's having to go back to that house. But it becomes obviously very daunting the way it's all relayed back to her again, all the details, and it like all comes back to her in this big way. And just as she's about to freak out because she's hearing about all this stuff again, where does she immediately go? But right into the arms of the man who did it. And she is now incredibly in love with him and ready to marry him at this particular moment. If they weren't married already by then, I can't quite remember that detail. But once we get into that, yeah, talking about the performance here from Bergman. This was basically, like, it's interesting that she has Casablanca, because I feel like this is almost like her her really big part. Like, when you associate with, like, you know, Vivian Leigh with Gone with the Wind or Streetcar, I think of this for Bergman before I think of something like Casablanca, weirdly enough. Which you would think would be impossible, but that's just how effective she is here, where it's like all the different things that she has to do. Because we talked about, you know, Fontaine being very impressionable also, making it all the more tragic whenever she would fall into Mrs. Danvers' traps, or just was, you know, generally overwhelmed by what was happening, and Rebecca herself. But here we get, I feel like we get a bit more, like Bergman had a bit more to work with. Um, where we have, because to my understanding, it's actually, Gregory's part's actually beefier in the play. And they, like, kind of, in the screenplay process, they gave Bergman more screen time, which is very interesting. Um, so we have the fact that she's obviously very trusting, despite what happened earlier in her life. When she meets somebody that she feels like she can hang on to, she clearly jumps at the chance, and just completely goes blindly in love. And it's like, I'm guessing we can say it's like this any glimpse of happiness that looks like it might bring her back to normalcy after the tragedy that happened very early, would be the case of how she was able to do this. And apart from, you know, obviously we don't know how long Gregory's been charming people, because obviously he had a specific reason to go after the aunt for the jewels and everything, but it's like, who knows, like, you know, before that, um, if that's, I don't recall that being addressed, but it's, yeah. And I see so many damn, even movies that I get really attached to, sometimes details will just go, that's just the way it happens. Um, but the thing here also is that we do get that sense of, like, the trauma has made her fragile, and, like, there's still something there. So it's like, when we know how that vulnerability is going to work into the story and the way it's going to be used in all the wrong ways, is just as totally believable as her being, like, young and in love. Which, of course, will eventually lead to the scenes where she starts cracking. And it's like and you're rooting for her the whole time, because there's so many instances where you can see her hanging on, where it's work to get her, to gaslight her. And she does become adamant about, like, you know, no, I never said that, or no, I didn't put this here. But it's like, it makes it all the more tragic when we can start to see it starting to work on her. And that would never have worked on film without this performance and what she was able to do with it and the way she was able to portray that. And to the point that it's so good that I would assume that, you know, if we didn't know the story going in, that we might think the same thing, that she's, like, the reveal is going to be she's insane. But of course, throughout the movie, we do know what's happening, so we have that. And what's really great about the other side of this, with Boye not only playing against type, but like, once again, what we were talking about with Mrs. Danvers, the way he's so calculating, but there's also times where he's like, it feels like he's literally all-seeing. Where, like, there's a moment when he's talking to Angela Lansbury, I think it's Angela Lansbury's first scene, and he's, like, over here at a shelf, and Elizabeth, the maid, comes in through the door while he's facing this way. So by all means, you would think he'd have no idea that she was there, or she had just walked into the room. And while he's talking, he addresses Elizabeth, and he addresses her before he turns around, like, seemingly before he would even know she was in the room. Like, he's looking over here, and then he says Elizabeth, and then he turns, and she's there, having just walked into the room. And it's like, stuff like that really sticks out to me. And there's a lot of other, like, you know, clever visual cues that they do that, where, like, when she's telling him the story at the beginning of what happened to her aunt exactly, and she says she was strangled, and the camera's on her through most of this story, and when she says she was strangled is one moment where the camera is just entirely on him, and then after she says she was strangled, then it cuts back to her. Like it's doing its own thing of basically circling, this is the person who strangled. And stuff. And the way they use shadows, the cinematography is amazing, which I'm really surprised it lost the Oscar for to Laura, I believe. Not that Laura doesn't look amazing, but This is basically, the cinematography and production design are basically, this is such a kind of a pretentious thing to say, but I mean it's so obvious, but it's true. It does kind of feel like, you know, the cinematography and production design are their own character. In the way of telling the story also, where there's the whole sinister vibe, obviously, but the fact that it sort of feels like we're in this really sort of dark and foggy place, and the way the lights are used, which obviously is very much a key to this whole concept, is like the lighting is involved. But the whole, like, there are moments where, like, he's actually in the process of gaslighting her, and we'll see, like, you know, the lights right behind him. Like I said, some obvious and some a bit more subtle about themselves. But both are appreciated because the movie looks so good visually. But then we have how we basically feel about his character, and how that's gonna make us feel about the movie itself, because he is so incredibly hateable. But when we're talking about, you know, a villain character, that's pretty much the best possible way to feel watching him. So when you get these scenes like there's a very similar scene when we're talking about the dress scene in Rebecca, where it's like, this is like the greatest thing that's ever happened to her, and just how south it goes. This moment where he has surprised her with a trip to the theater, supposedly, and it's just talking about it's almost infuriating. But then it gets to the point where he takes the picture is off the wall, and then they go through that whole thing, and he convinces her that she is not prepared to go out and to the theater. So they're just not going to do that. And it's this thing where, like, what I was talking about with Rebecca, any possible glimpse of happiness is suspect every time, and that's like the real tragedy of the characters, like Bergman here or Fontaine, and like I said, you bring in other characters also, like Lansbury, who is brought in, and it's like, she's so perfect here because she has that way about it where it's like, it seems like just by looking at their chemistry and the way they interact that Boya and Lansbury are like cahooting in this somehow. But it's played in just a way to where, like Bergman, we're just for a while we're just never quite sure. We kind of start in the same way the movie works. It's almost like we can convince ourselves that something is going on that may or may not be, and not just the stuff that we're seeing directly fall into that category. So all of that works. But then, like I said, Joseph Kahn eventually finds his way into this and starts to picks up the investigation from when Orion was strangled before, and this is basically like, it's very interesting. Not like taking Shadow of a Doubt out of the equation, bring Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte into it, which I talked about last year or 2 years ago, which is another movie I absolutely love. And he's one of the ones in the gaslighting position, in that Fontaine's sister is the other one, of course. And the thing here is, it's very clever casting in that case, but the thing about Cotton's presence here is that you would almost think it maybe would be too intrusive, because we love the Boya Bergman scenes as is, for such a portion of the movie. And it would seem like if it was going to branch off to something else and go like into an investigative sort of thing, it would almost feel like it's taking too much away from the really meaty stuff of the story, which is watching Boya do the gaslighting and Bergman reacting in whatever way. But once again, you go back to how hateable Gregory is as a character and how badly you want to see justice, and that is what makes the Cotton scene so enticing. It's like we really crave Boya's character being found out, despite how much we love to hate him. And it's like, so that's just a whole thing. That's just all the pieces are working, like every gear is making this machine run. Which is because even in some of the best movies, there's usually that one element that you're like, we could maybe take that out and focus more on where the really good stuff is. But yet they're able to find a balance there where it all comes together, and we're just maybe not just as eager about those moments, but we're certainly to see the direction we're headed is taking us in a very satisfying direction, hopefully. Um, but that's the thing though, is like when it's the whole idea of is there going to be hope? Because even when she does eventually meet Cotton and he does start kind of figuring out what's going on here, the game is still being played. And so it's like this whole thing of you want that justice so bad, but it's like when you're like trained to not believe yourself, like what happens when you hear the actual truth. And the fact that they thought to play with that a little bit, because it could have been very easy for Cotton to just, come in with a cape and say, this is what's going on, and Bergman says, oh, well, thank God, I thought I was insane for a second. The fact that we actually do have to deal with continuing consequences of what Boya has been doing, and the hopefully the seemingly long-term damage that it is starting to cause. But once again, we do get to a point to where we do get to a very satisfying outcome, and along the way we do have. I don't quite know how to explain this. The movie is like it's like melodrama, but it doesn't really have like a feeling, like a melodramatic feeling. It feels kind of a bit more straightforward. Just some scenes are, what depending on the context, done in kind of big, showy ways. But I feel like it could, especially being based on a play, it'd be very easy to get a bit, melodramatic and over the top, especially as far as performances go. But but when it does start to go big, it feels natural to the point we've gotten to at that particular time. And then finally, when we get to the very end, and we see that Bergman has reached a point of like a potential thirst for vengeance, is this really great moment. But of course, everything sort of smooths out and things don't go to the extreme, and we hope that she's, going to be better off. So, like I said, the fact that they do kind of throw in that there is potential long-term damage to that kind of thing is very interesting, but I think for the most part, where we end up in a good place. So, yeah, I guess that's pretty much it for this. I would say I took to Gaslight, Gaslight I took to immediately the first time I saw it, and Rebecca kind of grew on me over time. But nowadays, Rebecca's the movie that I tend to go back to more. But Gaslight is still just as amazing and satisfying as it's ever been. So, I think, and maybe it's a cop-out to always go with the Hitchcock movie, but more often than not, I probably would. So, there's that also. So, yeah, so the next thing is, I'm not entirely sure what the next thing is, apart from, we're going to talk about Rebecca's remake that just came out on Netflix, but apart from that, I'm still going to cram in a bunch of videos before the month is over, and we'll talk about that stuff. But until then, I think that's pretty much it for this.